Peter Meehan, Principal of St. Mark's, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you for this evening's talk by Dr. Stephen Millies. The community of St. Mark's at UBC is comprised of St. Mark's College, St. Mark's Parish, and Corpus Christi College, and together we are the legacy of more than 90 years of continuous Catholic presence at the University of British Columbia. At the Catholic Center of the university, we serve the needs of Catholic higher education in the province through a range of undergraduate, graduate degree programs, continuing education, and public lectures. Tonight's public lecture is presented by St. Mark's new Center for Christian Engagement. More than 50 years after the close of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Francis is leading a renewal of the Church that is deeply embedded within the Catholic intellectual tradition, which emphasizes that learning means discovering and growing in the truth. Christian engagement, the Center for Christian Engagement at St. Mark's, seeks to create a culture of encounter and dialogue by creating opportunities to address the challenges associated with the disengagement of Christians from the Church and the life of faith. Tonight's speaker and his subject matter will, as I will explain, provide us with such an opportunity. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Photography. There is one official photographer, the great Sarah Scally, circulating the room right now. You're welcome to take photos from your phone, but please turn off the ringer and the flash. For those of you who use Twitter, please feel free to tweet along with us using the hashtag SMC Lectures. Following Dr. Millies' address, there will be a brief time for questions, be moderated by Dr. Nick Olkovich. As a courtesy to the audience, please keep your questions brief and to the point. You'll be invited to direct your questions to Dr. Millies from the microphone, which is there. Author and political theorist Stephen P. Millies was born and raised in the Chicago area, where as an undergraduate, he originally, and I think astutely, chose to study history at Loyola University, Chicago. I'm a historian, okay, I can say that. Before continuing his academic journey at Washington's Catholic University of America, earning MA and PhD degrees in political theory. Dr. Millies' academic work focuses on the relationships between history, religion, and politics, especially as they intersect with the Roman Catholic intellectual tradition. Examining writers in both the liberal and conservative political traditions, Dr. Millies is interested in the ways that historical understanding shapes the encounters between religious belief and the politics of pluralism. As a church-state historian myself, I understand Steve as an intellectual fellow traveler. They say that in polite company, one should not discuss two subjects, politics and religion. My sense of Steve, after knowing him for not even 48 hours, is if you took those two off the table, he would have very little to say. From 2003 to 2017, Dr. Millies taught at the University of South Carolina, where he was named the Strom Thurmond Chair in Political Science. That always gets a laugh. It's amazing. It's always good for a laugh. In 2017, Dr. Millies' biography of Chicago Archbishop Joseph Cardinal Bernardin was awarded first place in the biography category by the Catholic Press Association Awards. His most recent book is Good Intentions, A History of Catholic Voters' Road from Roe to Trump. Bringing his journey full circle, in 2017, Dr. Millies was named Associate Professor of Public Theology and Director of the Bernardin Center at the Catholic Theological Union in his hometown of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Millies, who will speak to us tonight on Our Dream Soars Higher, Pope Francis' Call to Civic and Political Love. Dr. Millies.
Hello. And hello. And thank you all very much. I wish everyone could have the experience of hearing themselves introduced like that. It's humbling in a way that leaves me believing that the only smart thing to do at this point would be to say thank you all very much for coming and good night. But as it is, I've committed to an evening of impolite conversation. on religion and politics, and so I think I ought to go ahead with that. I do just want to say a few quick words of thanks on my own. First of all, this is my second trip to Vancouver, the second time that I've been here, and it's been such a pleasure to discover that Vancouver in the last 48 or 72 hours that I've been here is a place where rain does not fall. Thank you for that. That's been spectacular, and I really do love your city. I very much hope to come back to it. The hospitality I've experienced here at St. Mark's College has been nothing but extraordinary, and I want to thank Yujin Han, who I don't see, but I feel sure must be somewhere doing something helpful and important. There she is, yes. Thank you, Yujin. I want to thank your president, Peter Meehan, who's been a wonderful host, and I hope I can say has become a good friend. And I want to single out Dr. Nick Olkovich, who is sitting over there. I was fortunate to meet Nick at a conference in Dublin in 2016. We were there during the Brexit vote.
Yeah, that's right.
It was all very exciting. And it's been good getting to know Nick. Nick does theology in a very political way. I do politics in a very theological way. As Peter was suggesting earlier, it's an odd space to find oneself in. But I'm very grateful to have found fellow travelers. We who are Roman Catholics know what it means to live in history. There are few subjects to which we've devoted more reflection in the last 2,000 years. The earliest moments of the church were preoccupied by the problem of history. And we should make no mistake, it was a problem. The early church, expecting Jesus' swift and prompt return, didn't quite know what to do with history. How should we live in time with the expectation that time is running out and paradise lurks just around the corner? The early Christians had to learn to let go of their expectation that history would come to a quick end. St. Augustine, in the 5th century, more than anyone else, gave us the language with which to understand the now, not yet quality of Christian life in the world. We are the city of God, a people on a pilgrimage in the world, walking together in history. The city is both here and we are journeying toward it together. Yet, the expectation of a release from history and all that life in this world's imperfections imposes on us would dog our civilization for many more centuries after Christianity introduced the idea of an escape from history with the expectation of a second coming. This is the same expectation that tempted centuries of Christians to believe they could master history by combining the church with the power of the state. If only we invest a king with divine right, they thought, we'll set the world straight. We'll escape our sinful and imperfect condition. And of course it was not so. Or, if only we craft our laws in conformity with the divine law, we'll live in a kingdom of justice and peace. And of course, it was not so. Or, if only we carry the gospel to the edges of the earth, converting and baptizing all the peoples we meet and making good Western Christians out of them, we will hasten the coming of the reign of God. And of course, it was not so. Our dreams of escaping history or speeding along the millennial pace of salvation history in the end are earthbound and fail because they're earthbound. They fail really because we expect to find our salvation here on earth when we dream in this way. In a similar way, we can understand the misbegotten political dreams that have caused so much human suffering over the last few centuries, also as imprudent, hubristic efforts to find a release from our human condition and to build a paradise here on earth. This was the dream born from certain intellectual strands of the Reformation era and which gave rise to Enlightenment and German idealism in the 18th and 19th centuries, the rationalist perfectionist of the revolutionary Jacobins, and the Hegelian historicism that begets eventually the workers' paradise of Marxist-Leninism and the pure racial dreams of Hitler's Germany, the whole ideological terror of the 20th century, because, didn't you know, we humans are history's masters. We can bend history to suit our desires and remake our world according to our own designs. Or, so the dream of our mastery has told us again and again. I begin with these reflections on history and our dreams of mastery because they point us toward perhaps the most important fact we need to grasp here in 2019, amid a global political crisis whose only most visible manifestations are the vulgar brutality of the Duterte and Erdogan regimes in the Philippines and Turkey, or the integralist authoritarianism of Poland's Law and Justice Party, or Hungary's turn toward authoritarianism under the Orbán government, or the malign influence of Vladimir Putin's Russia, or the rise of nationalist parties in Western Europe and just south of us tonight in the United States. Those more visible dimensions of our global political crisis, for as present and as pressing as they are, can tend to distract us from the uglier and harder truth of the matter, which is this. For a long time, we believed we were immune. We had the answers. It couldn't happen to us. The old political problems all have been solved, and we have mastered history. The Berlin Wall came down 30 years ago this week. The victory celebrations began quickly. 3 days after the wall fell, the New York Times Foreign Affairs column predicted confidently that autumn 1989 is only the beginning. On the opposite side of the same page, Flora Lewis enthused that the people have snatched their history away from the rulers. All of this came in the context of an article Francis Fukuyama had published earlier that year under the title The End of History. And I should say for an audience that his title in that summer of 1989 appeared with a question mark after it. By 1992, when Fukuyama had adapted the article into a best-selling book, the question mark had disappeared. What was Fukuyama's argument? For this, if you'll forgive me, I must talk about Hegel. But take comfort, because you're already prepared to hear about him. Moments ago, when I talked about the ways that German idealism and Marxist-Leninism led to confident feelings that we had mastered history, I was talking about Hegel. If you understand only one idea in Hegel's thought, and that would be plenty, understand that Hegel believed history was a process by which freedom is realized in human consciousness. Hear some of the exuberant confidence of Hegel's late Enlightenment 19th century circumstances in that idea. The shackles of the medieval world were being thrown off all over Europe in one liberating revolution after another, giving rise to a cheerful confidence, much as our world felt 30 years ago when the wall came down. The horizon of freedom seemed endless, and the trajectory appeared to be one way. Humanity followed a direction of progress through history toward the realization of our full potential and freedom. This Hegelian idea rested at the core of Marx's revolutionary thought. Industrial capitalism, much as medieval feudalism, sows the seeds of its own destruction. The revolution brings about the workers' paradise as an end of history, where full human freedom becomes realized, much as Hegel saw that process at work in the liberating revolutions of his early 19th century. And if all this sounds familiar, it should. It is, more or less, the Christian promise of salvation, except Hegel and Marx and all the others promised salvation in the world, in human freedom, in an earthly paradise. They're unwilling to wait for Jesus to return. We humans would take matters into our own hands, and this, in substance, was how Francis Fukuyama interpreted the end of the Cold War. This begins to set a context for how we should understand some of that post-Cold War enthusiasm about the end of history. In Fukuyama's own words, quote, "The last thing I want to be interpreted as saying is that our society is a utopia, or that there are no more problems. I simply don't see any competitors to modern democracy." And that, finally, is the proposition I want to examine as we begin to assess the crisis in which we find ourselves now 30 years later. The proposition is not that history has stopped and the problems are solved. There still are bad actors like Mohammed bin Salman and Kim Jong-un, but perhaps more important and a more immediate concern is that clearly, even the world's democratic states now are flirting with the sort of authoritarianism that Fukuyama had relegated to the past. It's as though we reached the end of history, the earthly paradise where free democratic states face no real competition any longer, and then we retreated from it. The proposition we need to re-examine is the one which says we ever should place so much confidence in ideas, be they political or theological, that reassure us that all the hard work belongs in the past. The big questions are answered, we possess the solutions, and paradise lurks around the corner if we just follow the plan. What I want to examine from our vantage point today, in other words, is whether women and men living in our world are up to the challenge of governing ourselves with wisdom and prudence. Can we even say it with confidence any longer about Western Europe, the United States, the whole North Atlantic bloc that prevailed in the Cold War? Let's pause over those last questions for a moment to feel their weight. The political crisis that's unfolded during the last 3 years since the Brexit vote, culminating in the illegal prorogation of Parliament, successfully demonstrated that many in Britain would sacrifice the Constitution and the institutions of representative and participatory government in hope of achieving a desired outcome. They want nothing so much as for their side to prevail. And anything seems worth doing in order to achieve it. And even as the British judiciary intervened to set things more or less right, the fact remains that substantial numbers of Britons are more committed to interest and party than they are to the free institutions of government that have safeguarded public liberty for centuries. In the US, the ongoing conversation of the Trump presidency concerns the durability of political norms and conventions which are, candidly, under daily assault by the President of the United States, and even more precisely, by a major political party and a firm 38% or so of the voters who will support him no matter what, even if, as he famously suggested, and his attorney argued recently in federal court, he were to shoot someone on New York's Fifth Avenue in broad daylight. Who have we become? Who are we any longer? And what misbegotten political dream has brought us to this precipice? Amid all this, Canada has had federal elections this year. I read the papers. Rick Mercer wrote about it recently for the Washington Post under the headline, "Welcome to Canada's Underwhelming Election." And he quotes one unnamed observer who lamented, "Who knew gray came in so many shades?" Well, maybe. The excitements that Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau offer us, perhaps we can say, do pale when we compare to them the more colorful figures now dominating the global conversation whom I named earlier. But there are significant signs that the stirrings in Canadian politics are darker than they appear at a quick glance. You won't need this visitor to tell you what polling disclosed about Canada earlier, I guess last month. The election results showed that both Mr. Trudeau's Liberal Party and the Conservatives, which both once drew supporters from across the country, could no longer do so. 2019 has disclosed the same polarizations of region, class, education level, and religious participation that have divided nations around the world have begun to show themselves now here. No matter how gray and bloodless Trudeau and Scheer may appear to be, or how much Canadian politics may yet appear still to be immune to the primal forces now moving politics around the world, there are reasons to worry things won't be so quiet for so long. As the lone American in the room tonight, I think, unless Andrew Scheer is here,
That's funny.
Thank you. Let me say that I recognize what's underway here. The sorts of regional divisions you'll find among the Western provinces, the East, and the Quebecois are natural. We expect this sort of thing in any nation large enough to span a continent. It's hard enough to get one family living in the same house to agree on a movie. To create one political culture in a continental state is a bit too much to hope for. We're only human beings, and Canadians are as human as we are in the US or Europe or anywhere else where regional differences always have existed. Those regional differences, of course, to some degree determine ideological and political differences. It's not that people move to Fort McMurray because they like the oil and gas industry and they believe climate change is a hoax, observed a political scientist at Wilfrid Laurier University. If you took the oil and gas industry and plunked it down in downtown Montreal, people there would support it. I think that's more or less true. People generally form their politics out of their own understanding of who they are. And even once they do that, it's not a necessary corollary that forming our politics out of how we understand ourselves means we need to begin to think of someone else as an enemy. Differences can mean that we simply disagree. There's no need for these sorts of differences by themselves to raise the stakes to the apocalyptic levels where we find so much political discourse. For a long time, we were able to have divisions without this newfound rancor. But more recently, we've been losing the capacity to do that in my country and in lots of other places too. I think it's because those differences have been exploited. Our sense of our communities as places where we could find common ground together over our differences has been disrupted by people with other agendas and who promise more than living together peacefully. They promise that one side can win history through politics. The 2000 US presidential election found Al Gore and George W. Bush evenly matched, and the nation and the world waited for 6 weeks after the election to learn who would win Florida's 25 electoral votes and the presidency. As Bush strategist Karl Rove looked ahead to a re-election campaign in 2004, he knew that the parties would continue to be evenly matched, and polling told him that Bush couldn't win by converting Democrats to Republican voters. So instead, he focused on a turnout strategy. Rove surmised that outraging Republican voters would assure that they turned out in greater number than Democrats and Bush would win, which is what happened. The 2004 Bush campaign focused its attention on two issues with which Andrew Scheer's engagement proved antagonizing in the federal elections: abortion and LGBT rights. The effect in 2004 in the states was to arouse and inflame cultural differences that exist naturally in a large nation and fall along lines of region, class, education level, and religious participation. Karl Rove did it in order to win an election. He succeeded. Our American polarization didn't begin with that 2004 Bush campaign, of course, and other things have happened since that also have divided us. But I'd pause here just to observe that Andrew Scheer is a practicing Catholic, which created expectations among those inside and outside the church about him, and that a critical part of Rove's 2004 strategy was what he called Catholic outreach. Catholics played more than a small part in driving the American polarization, and I fear perhaps we can say they're playing a role here in Canada as well. It's not only Catholics and Americans, of course. Boris Johnson fomented Brexit simply for personal ambition, and a Leave movement followed him because he exploited natural differences masterfully. A Remain movement that didn't even know it existed before it was challenged sprung up in opposition. But once that dynamic gets underway, very soon one finds all that remains is the spirit of opposition. It quickly becomes a habit. And even today, as it seems Britain's far less likely than ever to leave the European Union actually, the spiraling feedback loop of social animus has become a natural part of the British landscape. Leavers and Remainers are locked in opposition. Those positions map roughly onto party division, regional identity, class, and education level. Whether Britain leaves or remains, this will not go away easily. We know it because we've seen it before. But I'd return to the role the Catholic Church plays in all this, not just because of the substantial role the Church has played in my country's polarization, or because Andrew Scheer is a Catholic, but because it's the engagement we have with the world as Catholics and as Christians and as believers that brings us together here tonight. In 2004, I met a Jesuit priest from somewhere near here in Western Canada. I don't recall where, and I wish I remembered his name. He heard me give what I thought was a very smart presentation on the controversy surrounding John Kerry, a Catholic who'd been nominated for president in that year by the U.S. Democratic Party. My Jesuit colleague told me that my paper was very interesting, but he assured me these sorts of arguments about Catholics in public life in the U.S. that I was describing were, his words, only an American problem. I remembered that when I saw the debate on the federal elections from a Catholic perspective hosted by the Archdiocese of Toronto last month, where Cardinal Collins introduced representatives from 5 major parties and called on the audience to listen and reflect on the positions of candidates with whom they disagreed, so they could make informed decisions as voters, weighing information and perspectives in good faith. The respectful, hospitable tone was striking. And in fact, speaking as an American Catholic, it was extraordinary to see a cardinal sharing the stage with parties that support LGBT rights and abortion rights. That's not the sort of thing that happens in the United States, where our church leaders long ago abandoned a commitment to discourse and dialogue over disagreements. We've been turning ourselves into knots over Catholics in public life in the United States since Mario Cuomo in 1984, down until just 2 Sundays ago when Joe Biden was refused communion in South Carolina. It's a familiar American problem that places like Canada seem to have been able to avoid. I don't mind saying that Canadian Catholics have shamed us for our lack of charity in political life, and really, I would say, our lack of prudence. And yet, in Ontario, on October 19th, when Andrew Scheer promised to hold a judicial inquiry and get to the bottom of what Justin Trudeau has done, you know what the crowd began to chant. Lock him up. Lock him up. News reports said, I don't really know. News reports said Scheer seemed uncomfortable, maybe a little surprised. But the truth is this, that Andrew Scheer, like Boris Johnson and like Donald Trump, has used rhetoric that's tapped into that political poison that's spread around the globe, which falls along lines of region, class, education level, and religious participation to transform natural disagreements into apocalyptic confrontations. And in places like Poland and in the US, that poison has a Catholic flavor. It's a poison many Catholics have drunk and have shared with the political community. It's also a poison that calls to mind the opposition Pope Francis has found outside and inside the Catholic community. I've drawn the title of my remarks this evening from the 4th chapter of Pope Francis's 2013 Apostolic Exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, or The Joy of the Gospel. Chapter 4's title in English is translated as The Social Dimension of Evangelization. Yet its substance is more alarming than that rather dull title. It's the portion of the document that aroused alarms in 2013 for its assault on our worldly assumptions about how things should be. It's why the Washington Post described the document as Francis's stinging critique of capitalism. It's why the BBC asked, is the Pope a communist? It's why Forbes, a financial magazine for corporate barons, dismissed Evangelii Gaudium as papal bull. In sum, Evangelii Gaudium is where Francis began to make enemies. It's where Francis wrote that we're not simply talking about ensuring nourishment or a dignified sustenance for all people. He wrote, rather, our dream soars higher. Writing about how social concern is the center of Christian life, Francis begins by making clear that the gospel is not merely about our personal relationship with God, nor should our loving response to God be seen simply as an accumulation of small personal gestures to individuals in need, a kind of charity a la carte, or a series of acts aimed solely at easing our conscience. Christian life demands something more radical. What that is must challenge everything comfortable that the world around us tells us every day. And challenging that consensus, it also must upend the too casual way that we Christians too often think of ourselves as living in history. I say radical, by the way, very much on purpose. It's from the Latin word radix, for root. Being radical means going to the roots of something. Francis wants to explode our comfortable social reality by going directly to the roots of our Christian faith, directly to the gospel and all of its terrifying challenges for how we otherwise might want to live. Forgive me as I read you one more passage from Evangelii Gaudium to illustrate what I'm talking about. It's a sentence with only 11 words, but we need to spend some time unpacking it. It's the big quote in the middle of that absurd handout I've given you. That sentence is, "True Christian hope, which seeks the eschatological kingdom, always generates history." Our real purpose, the dream to which Francis calls us, is contained entirely in that sentence. But we're going to have to unlock all of its meaning first. Begin by going back to where I began, with the awkwardness of being a Christian living in history. It's the source of so many of our problems today, and it's been the source of so many problems historically. Christianity dangled the idea of escaping from history in front of the human race 2,000 years ago. It's what we mean by Jesus' return, and a theological term for that is the eschaton. True Christian hope, which seeks the eschaton, the eschatological kingdom, always generates history. True hope seeks the reign of God in the eschaton, after the end of time. False hope seeks a false reign of God in this world, an escape from history. But what does this have to do with our social and political problems? A bad answer has always been that we'll hasten the reign of God, speed up the end of time by trying to build a paradise here on earth. That's what those Catholic empires and what the Marxists did. We know Francis doesn't mean that because he's not talking about an earthly paradise at all. He refers to the eschatological kingdom, the city of God, after Jesus' return as the goal for our hopes. Another bad answer is that we should simply wait out history. Let the world take care of itself and Jesus will sort it all out when he comes back. Francis can't possibly mean that in a chapter that's concerned with the social dimension of evangelization. The whole chapter is about our social mission, our responsibility to and for the world. So if the two obvious answers are bad answers, we know something greater is going on here. Something more challenging and more daring than those two varieties of what we might call false Christian hope, which are either building a paradise on earth or simply doing nothing because we think the world doesn't matter. There's this other idea in that short sentence we should notice. True Christian hope, which seeks the eschatological kingdom, always generates history. What a strange idea. History happens by itself, doesn't it? Generating history? We know in the ordinary sense, generation is about making something. It's an activity. It's a thing we do. In a more particular sense, generation is about reproduction. But Francis guides us toward his meaning a little bit later in that chapter, where he writes about an authentic faith, which is never comfortable or completely personal, and which always involves a deep desire to change the world, to transmit values, to leave this earth somehow better than we found it. What I want to highlight is how closely interrelated those three things are: to change the world, to transmit values, to leave this earth somehow better than we found it. Two of those three things are about our social mission: to change the world and to leave the earth somehow better than we found it. But of course, both of those also are about our responsibility to the future, or we might say, about future generations. It's the middle term that brings the idea home. To transmit values. It's our mission of evangelizing, spreading the gospel through the witness of our lives, which must be social witness lived among other people, that we generate, that we reproduce the Christian message. We Christianize the history we live in today by living Christian lives that challenge us and others. We remake the world in the image of the gospel. We bring forth and advance toward the eschatological kingdom as a pilgrim people on earth, whose relationship to the reign of God as now, not yet, shapes our relationship to the world. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The doing of God's will on earth lives the kingdom in this moment and brings forth the kingdom in history slowly as we march through time toward the end of time when Jesus will return. We don't escape from history. We bring forth the kingdom toward the end of history in history. It's our living in hope toward the reign of God that generates history, which is our progress toward God's reign. Here's the important part. The work is never completed in history, in the world, in time. I wish I had a better analogy, but like rolling a boulder uphill to watch it roll back downward and then roll it back uphill again, this work has to be performed over and over with each generation against the temptation to live as the world lives, to live for success in history, and to master our place in history and the world. Our dream soars higher because our challenge is greater, which is why so many of us flee from that challenge. And still, even so, with such a daunting task in front of us, we are called to be a people of hope and joy. The gospel promises us that the doing of these difficult things every day brings us joy and hope. True Christian hope, which seeks the eschatological kingdom, always generates history. We know this if we know the joy that can be found in daily acts of self-denial and service to others. It is a joy we find in humility, not mastery. And this is Pope Francis's call and encouragement to us amid the global crisis of the 21st century in which we're living. This is the perspective of Pope Francis's most important writing, his 2015 encyclical letter Laudato Si, which is misunderstood if we think of it only as a document about environmentalism or climate change. If you haven't read Laudato Si, please read it. But most importantly, read chapter 4, where Pope Francis discusses a revolutionary idea, integral human ecology. It is a simple and radical idea that is blindingly obvious when we think about it for just a moment. Integral human ecology means only this: everything is interrelated. A phrase that repeats in this section of Laudato Si again and again. An encyclical letter about the environment, of course, can't avoid being about economy or culture or the common good or about our responsibility for the future, because all of those things take place in the environment. When we discuss care for our common home, an issue we tend to box up and separate from other issues as merely environmental, Francis reminds us that all of it and everything around us is part of the same creation and proceeds from the one same single creative act. There are no merely environmental issues or pro-life issues or economic issues or social issues or moral issues. They all come from the same source. They're all integrated in each of our lives because we all experience them in one creation. We people of the 21st century tend mostly to believe that we're individuals, isolated and in control of ourselves entirely, living lives distinct from one another's. And we tend to think of everything else that way. Francis reminds us powerfully in Laudato Si, that's not true. Our dream soars higher. These are particularly important facts to recall as we look around us at what I've called the crisis of the 21st century. Not just rising nationalism, but also economic inequality and the individualism that says other persons, whether migrants or the poor or the unborn, are disposable. Or the effects of that point of view on the earth, on us, on our children, and how all that finally is the same crisis. Not a range of separable problems, but at heart one singular problem. Feeling ourselves to be masters of ourselves, of our world, and of all history, we fail to love. Here, I would close by saying something about politics that's very important to me, And I think it's something Pope Francis and I see very much the same way, something we all need to talk about a lot more. In Laudato Si, Francis says it all rather straightforwardly. It's a long quote. It's the long quote on that handout. This is from Laudato Si. Love overflowing with small gestures of mutual care is also civic and political. And it makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. Love for society and commitment to the common good are outstanding expressions of a charity which affects not only relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. That is why the Church set before the world the ideal of a civilization of love. Social love is the key to authentic development. In order to make society more human, more worthy of the human person, love in social life, political, economic, and cultural, must be given renewed value, becoming the constant and highest norm for all activity. And that's it. But while that excerpt is from Laudato Si, it's not just Francis. Francis quotes there from Paul VI. He also quotes there from Benedict XVI. But of course, that's only because this is what Christianity has always told us about who we are. The poison in our politics is the mistaken idea that we have to defeat someone, that the next election will settle things, and that we'll get everything we want, and that we'll win, that we should win, that we can achieve a paradise. We can cross some sort of finish line that will set the world aright once and for all. And when did that ever happen? Yet, over and over, we behave as though this time it might be true. We hear a call like the one Francis makes for a better world, which means doing that difficult work where we only see a little success at a time and which must be done again and again. And we imagine that our action will bring about the best world, where, as Scripture tells us, every tear will be dried and there will be no more death. As though we could hasten the end of history, as though we can bring forth the reign of God on our timetable and in our way. The reign of God is now, not yet. It's in our midst, here among us, within us. We are the city of God on a pilgrimage toward the city of God. It is both and. It's a paradox. It's challenging, and it's true. We already are God's holy city. We cannot yet reach God's holy city. So what do we do with that problem? There is an answer. We can search for that answer in the heart of what politics is, in discourse with one another as a community, in the space where we gather as a people united by our love for one another and for the good. In other words, we search in the relationships we have with one another over our differences and sinful imperfections. We need to recover a little bit of that sense of politics, a richness of what that word really means. Too often, we say politics, but we mean self-interest, or bitter rivalry, or partisanship. And it just isn't so. From Greek times, politics means what the people share in common. It's our shared common life, our relationships. It's the space where we gather as a people united by our love of one another in the good. Or we should see it that way. Our politics would be better if we did. And it's not complicated. It begins with what Pope Francis said in Laudato Si, love overflowing with small gestures of mutual care. It's how we generate history, how we find true Christian hope. Just this past Sunday, we heard about it in the reading from the Book of Wisdom. God loves all things that are and loathes nothing in creation. That includes the people with whom we disagree. But quite often, we're like the people in last Sunday's gospel. who heard Jesus say that he must stay at the house of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Do you remember their reaction? When they saw all this, they began to grumble. All these followers of Jesus who'd come out to hear him. Zacchaeus is a sinner. Zacchaeus is not one of us. We're more deserving than Zacchaeus. Like us, they were human beings. These divisions are natural. Of course we judge others, and we want to decide who should win and who should lose. But that is precisely what we must overcome in politics, in the church, in life. And what shall we do to overcome it? Love, overflowing with small gestures of mutual care. Francis has written about how a community that cherishes the little details of love, whose members care for one another and create an open, evangelizing environment, is one where the risen Lord is present. And he goes on to say, I think especially of the three key words: please, thank you, and sorry. Because the right words, spoken at the right time, protect and nurture love. Speaking these right words, little deeds of humility, is where we must begin and re-begin with each new day. Always traveling down the pilgrim road toward the city of God as the city of God, a destination we believe we will reach, but we do not know when or how we'll reach it, even as the city of God already is here among us. Our faith, our humility and love that begins with please, thank you, and sorry. Small gestures of mutual care are the necessary first step. And the second, and the third, and on in our daily lives and in politics. When we embark on the pilgrim road in this way, we can be sure that we will never step falsely into the fantasy that we have the answers, that we're in control, that we can win, we can hasten the end of history all on our own and not on God's time. Were the 2019 elections the start of Wexit here in Canada? Can thuggish nationalism take root here? Is there no hope we can live together in a civilization of love, seeking a better world as a community of fellow pilgrims and nations? I don't think Canadians are any more immune to the danger than Americans are. But it's in your hands to build your community. It's in all our hands. It depends on how we all regard one another. It depends on whether we can love. It depends on how high our dream soars. Thank you very much for your kind attention today.
Thank you so much. Did you want to take a little water?
No, I just wanted to make a terrible joke that I've been looking at this water with the pitcher and the glass over on the credence table for me tonight, and I've worried when you started the questions that you were going to come and pour it on my fingers.
Thank you so much for your talk tonight, Dr. Millies. My name is Nick Olkovich. It's an honor and privilege to hold the Marie Ann Blondin Chair in Catholic Theology here at St. Mark's College, and it's a real pleasure to consider Steve. Steve, is that all right to call you Steve tonight? To consider Steve a good friend of mine. We have a good chunk of time, I'd say 15 to 20 minutes, as long as Steve is all right with that, set aside for questions this evening. And I'm going to invite those who would like to ask a question to sort of line up over here. And we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. I would imagine that if you wanted to corner Steve during the reception after, you could probably do that if we don't get to you. And I'd just like to remind you to keep those questions as brief and to the point as possible so that we have give as many people an opportunity to say something this evening. I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and take some prerogative and ask you a first question, if that's all right, Steve. I mean, we've been talking for 2 days now, and it's been remarkable to have you here in town. Something that sort of was popping up in the back of my head throughout everything you were sort of saying this evening, the question of populism, right? The term itself, I don't think you really ever referred to. You sort of used the term nationalism a couple of times. Many people think that populism is something that is really only, it's a contemporary issue. and they're very inclined to, associate populism only with its sort of right-wing sort of expression. And what I was sort of hearing, and throughout most of your talk, was this idea that politics is really about how we construct the people. And we can do that in both inclusive and exclusive sort of ways. That's sort of one of the major sort of themes I was taking from what you said. And religion can play a role both in the negative and in the positive sort of sense. I'm curious to know what you sort of see, in the positive sense. Where do you see Christians in the sort of contemporary world here, particularly in North America, moving towards the creation of an inclusive understanding of the people? And one of the things that I sort of face on a day-to-day sort of basis, and how do you get people who are Catholics, and I think the Vatican II question is here in the background as well, to move from thinking of the people, particularly as the people of God, in exclusive sort of terms, to begin to think in more inclusive sort of ways. That's a big one, but I'll let you I'll let you think about it.
Thanks for that, Nick. Let me try to grab a few pieces of it.
Yeah, please.
First, I do, as a political theorist, I have a kind of an allergy to most ideological labels because I think they're kind of false. We need them, they help us talk, but I'm particularly allergic to fascism and populism. And the reason is because they have unusually less coherent meanings than most of the other. When I think of populism, I think of some of the populist movements of the American 19th century, the agricultural movements, or even something like American progressivism, and these things really partake more of a left-wing sort of a flavor. I think the danger of, I think you put your finger on precisely, though, where the danger is. The danger is exactly in whether we construct our sense of peoplehood, for want of a better way to put it, out of an inclusive or an exclusive sort of a sensibility. And the danger that fascism and populism, in the sense that we're using it today, both have in common generally is that they are built on, I think, a kind of a, I'll say a Girardian, but I think a kind of a really dark psychology of how people behave in crowds. That they depend on taking advantage and preying on people in ways that whip them up and turn them toward emotion rather than toward reason, which after all is what politics and if we believe in a divine creative word, what our Christian faith is supposed to call us to in the first place. I think that's a very strong sense of where the danger is. I think too that when we think about it from a perspective, at least of Catholic Christianity, I'm very encouraged always to think of the people of God in a very inclusive sort of way. That is to say, there's no person who wasn't created by God. So it's a very easy sort of thing for me to say, but I can certainly understood we've had some hard time working with that in ecumenical conversations, in interreligious conversations, and in political conversations as well. And I think, yeah, you're right that Vatican II lurks in the back of that. That's very much the work we have to do. I think what I would say, sort of in closing, to try to wrap it all up together, is that, you asked what can we look for here in the North American context, where can we see it happening, and I think I would have given a different talk if I saw it happening much. I think we are living through a lot of things. Some of them I talked about here, this political moment, but we're also living through the long reception of the Second Vatican Council. We're living through a lot of things, and I didn't even talk about technology and the ways in which that's changed our social relationships. We're living through a lot of things that have really upended our sense of what holds us together. And I think it's tended to accentuate the kind of latent individualism that's been laying around since the Enlightenment. I believe that I can articulate an answer that the churches broadly and that the Roman Catholic Church particularly can answer to that, and I've tried to begin doing that here tonight. But what I would say is I think from where we are right now, it's an uphill battle. And the last thing I'd say about that is, Peter and I were having this conversation this morning. I talked to someone recently who described the problem that the church, the Catholic Church at least, has right now. In the States, Pew has some data that in the last year and a half, 26% of the people who used to attend Mass on a weekly basis no longer do. The hemorrhage is now becoming remarkable, and the decline of faith among younger people is equally alarming. And it's a challenge for established churches churches, especially in the East and the Midwest, because they were built to be sacramental dispensaries, with the expectation that the people of God would always show up, because they always did, because it's always been here. We're not really built to evangelize. We never had to. We're going to have to learn how to fast. But that evangelization is not just about converting people in our CIA programs, and it's not just about admitting them to the sacraments, because that alone by itself, of course, is not Christian life. Christian life is what I've been talking about here. And for those of us who are in the pews, who are grumbling when Jesus talks about hanging out with the sinner, we need that ongoing conversion too. That, I think, finally, I found the answer to your question. That was it.
Very good, very good. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Millies, for being here this evening. I certainly celebrate, I think, your top-line message, which is, we've got to respect and civil discourse, and let's raise the level of respect in that civil discourse. And where I'm really disappointed in your remarks is that I think you take away from that message by, and again, you've only got a few minutes for your talk, to oversimplify, I think, the danger and the dilemma that we're facing in our society. I think that in respect to the way you explain Brexit, which if we had a day, you and I might be able to explore our different views on that. Because, the way you sort of throw together the Brexit, Trump experience and Scheer, on the one hand, ignoring the fact that we have practicing Catholics that are in leadership roles on the other side of the aisle, both in Canada and the US, that you could easily see the hypocrisy and the bad example that they're showing us as Catholics. And without really any need or recognition that there is a problem in that kind of behavior and their behavior, and is part of the discourse. We're Canadians, we play ice hockey, and there's a famous thing of sort of the retaliation penalty. So you might be playing hockey, and some smart, careful player might give you a little shiv in the ribs that nobody sees. And yet you react in a very bad way for everybody to see, and everybody calls you out for the penalty, the retaliation penalty, while ignoring the underlying foundational cause of what might have triggered that kind of behavior. And so I think in my view, it's really too simple for us to simply say, look at what a jerk Trump is, which is hard to argue with, as a way of explaining that the other behavior is appropriate. It may be more subtle, it may be more sophisticated,
Could I ask you
but
to
it's not necessarily...
be more specific about what you mean by that so I can follow you?
I'm sorry, more specific about what part?
About what you mean by the other behavior.
Well, for example, right to life issues, the secular, sorry, I can't even say that, secularization of issues such as climate change and the environment, which I think all of us think it's a good thing to be good to our earth and so on, but the confusion of being almost the deification of the earth and confusing that with the ultimate deity. And so the public discourse of our leaders are emphasizing issues and then drawing a reaction by those that disagree, and we are complaining about their behavior in the way they react, which is easy to criticize, but ignoring the underlying cause or danger, because there is danger out there, and just being nice, and I'm Canadian, is not just the answer. We can't ignore. Our Lord was a radical when he came to the earth, and he wasn't nice all the time. Anyway, I'll just stop.
Yeah, no, I don't think we disagree perhaps as much as you think we do. I would say a few things. The issues that have animated the populist movements that have risen up in all of these places that we've talked about, they're real, right? What I hear in the undercurrent of your question is a flavor of skepticism about elites that I'm not talking about. And those could be leaders in the church, those could be secular leaders as well. I think those are arguable points, and that's all fair. But here's, I think, something else I would say. I had the misfortune, although I miss it, of teaching Introduction to American Government to American undergraduates during the 2016 election. I'm not really trying to be cute. What I really mean is that I had this textbook that said these things that are always supposed to be true about how campaigns work and about how parties work and about how elections work. It just became increasingly clear that I was teaching about a fictional world, and it was very hard to talk about. I should tell you that one of the decisions I made very early on teaching politics was that I was going to remain as ideologically opaque to my students as I possibly could. And I could tell you some stories. I'm very proud of how successful I was at that. I had students who thought I was on both sides, and I was very proud of that because I didn't feel like I had the luxury of letting them dismiss me so easily. But it got harder in 2016, and this, I think, comes to the substance of your question, because politics isn't a contact sport. There are no retaliation penalties, and the problem is that we've begun to mistake it for that. Now, I agree with you completely that simply being nice, as you put it, and I'm from the Midwest, I'm as nice as anybody. Simply being nice is an insufficient answer. On the other hand, in the quarrel between those who try to embark on politics as discourse and those who embark on politics as force of one variety or another, this is no longer a two-sided bipartisan argument. Somebody's wrong. Politics isn't about any variety of violence, be it verbal violence or any other sort. I'm certain of this, because if it is about violence, then we don't have a civilization. We've spent 2,500 years wasting our time. This is no longer a thing about which we can say, well, good people disagree about whether you can chant "lock him up" at a rally. But that's hard to talk about in a way that leaves me looking opaque. I have to pick a side. And so what I would say is that I don't necessarily agree with you about equating the behavior of some prominent populist, nationalist whatevers with those who are elites, because for all of their failures, and you and I could have a good, long, and shared conversation about their failures that have brought us to this point, ultimately I'll take the folks playing by the rules over the folks who aren't. I don't even think that's a contest. But what I will say in closing, and where I do agree with you very much, is, and you're right, there's no time to get into everything. But look, the folks who are angry and who are empowering these political movements right now are responding to ways in which they've been failed by the political system. They've been failed by politics. They haven't been invited to be parts of communities that would allow them to flourish. And that's a real issue that we can't even get to right now, because we have this other problem with a sort of a politics of force replacing a politics of discourse. I'm not even sure how we change that dynamic before we get back to the other thing. And so there again, I surrender to you. I don't think being nice is going to do it, but on principle, I won't do anything else.
Good evening. I would like to offer a concrete example that perhaps you can illuminate. Mr. Trump actually provided for conscience rights among the doctors, caregivers, and the nurses and midwives, okay? And about 2 days ago, I think a circuit federal court considered it as unconstitutional. Of course, I realize that will still be litigated. But in the meantime, if you were a doctor, a nurse, or a midwife, in the middle of these things, what kind of options do you have other than martyrdom or acquiescence? And then in that context also, in your talk, how involved or lack of involvement is the Catholic movement or the Catholic action in the past been responsible for this state of affairs that we have right now?
Please be more specific about that.
I'm sorry?
Please be more specific about what you mean by Catholic action.
In other words, you say that, part of the reason why we are basically in this situation right now, call it whatever, is because Catholics have been acting the way they've been acting in the past. And so I said, now if we are in this situation whereby now we have a contending rules, okay, and Catholics are put in a bind, okay, is the lack of Catholic action responsible for the situation that we have, or is it because of Catholic action that are so strident that caused us to be in this situation whereby we become a zero-sum game?
Well, let me say the answer to your second question is much easier because there is no answer. That's a chicken and egg question, I think, really. I've written about this. My most recent book was about that. And I think that Catholics live in the world. And so there's a dynamic there that exists. The two play into one another. I'm not sure if I can find a starting point. Your first question is requires more treatment. First of all, I think it's important to point out nobody's going to be martyred for refusing to perform a morally questionable procedure, right? I mean, that's not going to happen in the United States. But they are going to face professional consequences of family and so forth. And there you're right, there are difficult questions of conscience. But difficult questions of conscience have been a part of the Christian experience for 2,000 years. I always, when I talk to undergraduates about this, I always like to ask the question, when's it okay to lie? When? When is it permissible morally for me to tell a lie? Well, we have answers to those questions. Thanks, St. Augustine. We have answers to those questions. But those are worldly accommodations. That's not strictly what the earliest church believed. That was the church coming to grips with its place in the world. When can I take up the sword and kill someone in another army? We have answers to those questions. Thank you, St. Augustine. Turns out I can do that, and all the bloody mayhem, the famine, right? Sexual violence, right? Death, sickness, everything that comes with war comes from that compromise. And I'll add, as I often like to ask the question, while we're so glib about questions of war, I'm quite sure that my government has committed more than a few abortions by means of cruise missile or drone strike over the last 2 decades. 8% of the human race is pregnant at any given time, tens of thousands of innocent, non-combatant civilian casualties in our wars on the other side of the world. We've committed those abortions. I don't hear anyone talking about them. But again, we make these compromises because we live in the world. Because the world's hard. That's why we seek the escape. Trump has, yes, sought the conscience protections. Good. Trump is not my ideal of a Christian statesman. And at the end of the day, and it goes back to my answer to the earlier question, at the baseline, we have to have a politics that we can participate in that is susceptible to seeking justice and peace. To me, that's the prior question before all of the other questions, even the most important moral questions. Because if we don't have a political conversation that's capable of bringing together people in good faith over their disagreements to deal with the hard questions and to give space for dealing with all of the morally compromising things that we have to deal with because we're in the world, well then getting that outcome doesn't impress me all that much. Overturning Roe, getting conscience protections, all the rest of it doesn't impress me because there's going to be an awful lot of human suffering that's going to accompany that win. So for me, the answer to your question is, Lord, I don't know what I do. That's why I became a professor. I have tenure and no one asks me to commit morally compromising acts, right? I barely work at all. But on the other hand, I think we're all grappling with that. I pay the taxes that pay for the unmanned drones. We're all grappling with it, and if you haven't thought about it yet, you're grappling with it too. Some folks are in a harder position, but if you take Christianity seriously, the two things I can tell you to be sure of are, one, you are morally compromised because you're in the world. And two, you need a community of justice and peace capable of dealing with that constructively together.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Rene. My profession is in engineering, and I felt like your talk, there is no harmony in it, like there is a big difference between your beginning and your end. They totally contradict each other. At the beginning, you started against Trump and Scheer. At the end, you were talking about Zacchaeus loving and caring and the love of Jesus. And these are two contradicting things. And as it mentioned earlier by a friend of mine, when he mentioned to you, you didn't take into consideration what the others did, let's say against Trump or Scheer or whatever, and compare it to what we call the Christian values. So nobody is saint. People at all fronts in the US or Canada, they are not that great leaders on both sides, but we have to make a choice. If we are Catholic and we really care about being Catholics, we have to stick to the Catholic values. I met with Cardinal O'Connor a few days before that meeting that had happened in Toronto, but he had certain views. And the really Christian Catholic views, nothing, it was not probably portrayed properly outside in the media. He allowed people to come in to talk, fine, but they were not his views of what others probably said against something voting Catholic. And how can we say that we are Catholic or Christian and so on when we see somebody is valuing certain Christian values that the other hate, instead of we go to him, to these leaders who at least have something better than the others, and tell them, please change your attitudes towards certain other elements rather than criticizing them and trying to wipe them to get back the bad people, the real killers. And all of us will be facing one time the judgment day. How can one face judgment day with God? And God will tell us, these are the simple things that I mentioned to you all, simple, straightforward, simplicity, like children should understand, that are written in the Bible, and very clear, and you go and allow yourself to vote for people who allow killing. Isn't the law saying if we allow, somebody is supporting people who are killing, we are part of the murder itself? That's my question. How can we live with ourselves and talk about love and so many things, and at the same time we show our hatred to people, at least if they are not at 50%, 60%, if one was to take it 50, 60 out of 100, rather 50 below zero?
Well, let's say first, there's been, I think, no whiff of any hatred in anything I've had to say here tonight. The substance of my reply would be that God loves all that is and loathes nothing in his creation. I don't believe in bad people. There are no bad people, except all of us. Right? The bad people is the first step down a very dangerous road. And we've gone too far down it. And when I say we, I mean the church. We have felt ourselves, for a variety of historical and naturally human reasons, we have felt ourselves privileged to stand in a position of judgment over the world. And as has been observed before, our church leaders have sort of proved rather remarkably over the last couple of decades, particularly, how that trust has been misplaced. But all that being said, you know, there's nobody in this room who doesn't have blood on her or his hands. Every last damn person. Every last person. Every last damn person has blood on her or his hands. For the way that we buy what we buy, for the way it gets made, for the stuff that we use, for for the taxes that we pay and what's done with them in our names, which is the good news about representative government. Here's the other good news about representative government, and I'm going to confess this is something that's bothered me for a very long time now. I believe in a church that is evangelizing, that is seeking to spread the gospel everywhere, mostly by the witness of our lives, as I've talked about. And I think that there has never been a better time in human history than now, because for all of the challenges that we face, the frank truth of it is, in places like this, we have more religious freedom than anyone's ever had in the history of the world. There should be no need to try to win at the ballot box, or in a courtroom, or in a legislative chamber, what we ought to be winning, person to person, conversion by conversion, one person at a time, the way we built the church in the first place. Go forth and make disciples of all nations. I oftentimes think if we did a little bit more of that, we wouldn't face quite so many of the political problems that we're talking about. We have the opportunity to do that, but instead, what we very often do is we behave like an interest group, a pressure organization, and we actually are lobbyists. And I'm just going to say, I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's adversarial. I think it leads us to thinking there are bad people we have to defeat. I don't think it's the Christian way. If we want the things I think we want, to live in a good world where suffering is minimized, when justice and peace are promoted, the way to do that is to be an evangelizing people. The win comes later.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name's Randy. It's a very practical question. Our current electoral system is first past the post. I suspect there's going to be a lot of pressure, maybe political will, to move to a proportional representation system in Canada. I think some of that pressure is going to be because of the conflicts that exist today, in terms of there not being representation from some provinces, federal representation. So my question to you is a proportional representation system, do you think it's a better system? Will it exacerbate the tension in politics? Or do you think it'll benefit the common good? And if it benefits the common good, do you think Catholics have a role where we could benefit in a proportional representation system versus the existing first past the post where it seems we have very few choices?
My honest answer to both of your questions is I don't know. But I can elaborate on how I don't know, because I know that's what you were looking for. You've described perfectly, I think, the conundrum. The advantage of a system of proportional representation is that it's going to admit more voices to the conversation, right? More folks are going to get heard. That's actually a good thing. The danger is we are in this weirdly centrifugal political moment where the center doesn't hold at all. The real challenge, as we talked about in the first question, is to construct a political community that actually agrees on some shared sense of the good. There's Augustine again. And it's getting very, very difficult to do that, even with a first-past-the-post system. Mm-hmm. I'm very concerned about anything that intensifies those centrifugal forces. At the same time, I have to say, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there, I lived in South Carolina when the 2016 election happened. I understand very clearly what the underrepresented, unheard people are angry about and why they're angry and why they should be angry. And a system of proportional representation that lets a little bit of the steam out by letting it into the discourse. Mm-hmm. I'd be cautiously optimistic about it, but the truth is, I think it's a roll of the dice. I really, really don't know. I keep coming back to this in my replies and in my talk too. I think it is not adequately appreciated how dangerous what we are in the middle of is. It really is, in a way, more fundamental than communism or Nazism or any of the rest of it ever really threatened us. It's really finally a challenge that asks whether this way of life is sustainable. It's not that we have some external enemy. The enemy is us. The question is, can we really be converted to the gospel, to reason? Do we really want to live together? And I worry that the ambient signs all around us are not very reassuring. One tweet at a time, one point that gets scored in this two-sided game at a time, we are tearing it apart. Simply from, again, to go back to the Greeks, tumos, chest thumping. Me, 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 me. I have to win. People like me, we are right. People like you, you're wrong. The common good, finally, has to be the common good. And we were talking about this before. The difficult thing that this new kind of politics that we have since the 30 Years' War, since the Peace of Westphalia, since 1648, it used to be much easier to rely on ethnic homogeneity or linguistic homogeneity or religious homogeneity. Having those things in common used to define us as a people. We've embarked on a way of doing it where a kind of a process and commitment to law or commitment to place is supposed to hold us together. But it's looser, and it's falling apart. And I don't know. If there's an answer, man, if proportional voting's the answer, I'm 100% for it. If not being nice is the answer, I'm 100% for it. Smarter people than me don't know what the answer is. What I do know is, and I'll close on this, is that if I don't do it, it doesn't get done. And the doing of it is the hearing people out and the engaging people in this conversation and attempting to do it with some amount of charity. Not to say, like giving away to the poor charity, but real Christian caritas, care for one another, small gestures of mutual care, love that begins with having so much regard for one another as to say, please, sorry, thank you. One more? I'll go all night.
I mean,
That's fine.
I had a feeling you would say that. I am aware of the time, and that was almost a natural break. However, Sam had been waiting a little bit, and I would love to let him get a chance
ahead,
here.
please.
Okay, cheers.
I'm going to get a little more water, though, while you ask.
Okay.
Oh, sure. I'm one of Dr. Olkovich's students, so you can always expect something good. Thank you very much for your talk. I think it was very good. You raised some very good points. So I'll close up with something very short. Should pro-choice or pro-abortion Catholic politicians such as Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau, or if you want to throw in Andrew Scheer because his party platform doesn't include anything pro-life, should these people be refused communion in accordance with Canon 915?
Short question. Long answer. Canon 915 says that those who commit grave offenses or who are manifest public sinners should not be admitted to the sacraments. I've got that right?
Yes. I hope so.
What's that?
I was only just Wikipediaing it right before, so.
So grave offenses are defined in the Catechism as violations of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. So here's where it gets interesting. First of all, we all do, right? But in the particular case, we're talking about abortion. We know we're talking about abortion. Neither Joe Biden nor Justin Trudeau, so far as we know, has either performed or procured an abortion. That's top line answer. Next down the list, formal cooperation, right? Moral theology tells us that the getaway driver also committed the bank robbery. And even if the getaway driver says, I want no part in this bank robbery, I'm just driving you away from the bank, the getaway driver is still guilty of cooperating in the act. All right? So the question we have is, do elected officials who uphold the law that leads to this outcome formally cooperate in evil? Is that a good formulation of it?
Sure.
That's hard. That's hard. Because here's the thing. I can't talk about the Canadian end of it. I don't know it as well. I can only talk about the American end of it. Every law school in the United States will teach you the same thing if you go pay them a lot of money. They will teach you that abortion is a constitutional right, the same as any other. Since 1973, it's been part of the Constitution of the United States. And what every U.S. senator and what every vice president says and what every federal employee says when they embark upon becoming public officials is they take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. There are no exceptions. Now, if in their hearts they're crossing their fingers over certain parts they disagree with, are they committing a grave offense in violation of the Decalogue? Are they bearing false witness when they do it? That's an interesting question. Leave it aside. Here's the better part. Manifest public sinners. They're doing it out and open. We see them doing it. That's what this is really about. This is really about scandal, right? This is really about the role that public officials are playing. But here's the problem. Expecting this from public officials is novel. You don't get to say this very often. It's something new in the 2,000-year history of the church. There have been excommunications and there have been denials of sacraments throughout the 2,000 years of Christianity, of course, but they've always been about schismatic issues. They've been about political quarrels over the investiture crisis in 1076 and on and on and on. I can't find a time when a public official, before quite recently, has been denied the sacraments for some public act that is regarded as morally evil. And in fact, I can think of a lot of Catholic public officials who have committed morally reprehensible public acts and received the sacraments and been buried from the church. That's all true. So the answer to your question, I think, finally comes down to this. What good does it do? And I mean that literally. What good does it do? Does it bring about a conversion? Does it draw the Catholic community together, dealing with difficult moral issues that are part of our ongoing political conversation, by the way, with everybody else who has a right to be represented under this system of government? And I must tell you, my Jewish friends and my Orthodox friends feel much differently about the abortion issue than we Catholics do. And it's not because they are secular atheists trying to have sex without consequences. It's because their theological position is different. But they vote for these public officials as well, and they have a right to be represented under law. So the answer to your question isn't a yes or no, which is, I think, the answer Cardinal Dolan gave. The answer is it's a pastoral question and it's a prudential question. But I will say this. If it's not some politician's home pastor, who's not in constant dialogue with that person, being a pastor to that person, I can't understand what good it does. To me, it looks like tumos, chest thumping, because I know the name of the priest who did it in South Carolina, because he told the press. There's where I think he told on himself, that I'm just not sure it was about building up the Catholic community or that it even was about abortion. I think it was about the win. I think it was about being the guy who denied communion to Joe Biden. I don't like that. If Joe Biden's pastor is having that conversation with him and he can't get communion in his home parish, that looks to me like a pastoral process that's underway, and that's a good thing. I don't care for this, not one bit. That's my answer.
Thank you very much.
Steve, very passionate and fulsome answers. I'm going to invite Peter to say a few last words.
Thank you, Dr. Millies, and thank you to our audience for the questions. That was a really robust session, and it shows our active engagement with these questions and with public life, which was really the point of tonight's talk. So thank you so much. I believe, where's Eugene? We have a small token of our esteem for Dr. Millies. Please join me in thanking Steve Millies. Before I invite you to join us in Plato's Cave for a brief session, and as Nick indicated, you may want to have a more private conversation with, he's not hearing confessions, but he's maybe giving some directions afterwards. I want you to know that on March 18th, we will have our next talk. Kathleen Cahalan, Professor of Practical Theology at St. John's University School of Theology and Seminary, and Director of the Collegeville Institute Seminars, will be speaking to us on the call to discipleship, the vocation to ministry, where Dr. Cahalan will explore how we understand the general calling of all the baptized and the particular calling to ministry in the church. Thank you for being with us. Please join us at Plato's Cave afterwards. Thank you.